When I picked up the receiver to ask my son Daniel about the date of his wedding, his wife-to-be, Sophie, answered the question for both of us with a tone so cool it felt like it traveled through the wire as ice. "We already tied the knot yesterday," she said, as if reciting a fact about the weather. "We only invited certain people." Certain people. The two little words landed in my chest and stayed there like a stone. For 3 years, I had been the quiet engine in their lives. $500 toward rent every month, help with groceries when their cupboards were bare, a sofa for their living room that I bought because they said their old one was falling apart, a secondhand refrigerator replaced with a new one when theirs finally died. I had furnished their apartment, paid for repairs, lent money for Sophie's medical bills, and handed over cash for weddings, rings, and sundry emergencies that cropped up at 2 a.m. I did it because he's my son. I did it because love was what I had to give. And apparently, I was not certain people. I stood in my modest kitchen, the phone a dead weight in my hand, while Daniel stared at the table as if he could make this entire conversation vanish by refusing to look at me. Sophie sat on the couch, my couch, and let out an easy laugh as if she'd said nothing that would upset anyone. The dress I'd chosen with so much care, a soft green silk I thought would complement the happiness on their faces, hung in my closet alongside the shoes I had bought to go with it, untouched, useless. I could already see myself in the photos I'd imagined, standing beside them, perhaps with a proud arm around Daniel's shoulder. Instead, I scrolled past pictures online where Sophie's family posed in matching smiles and Daniel raised a glass. I saw faces in the frames I did not recognize, celebrants around a cake, the laughter of people I'd never met. I had not been on the guest list. The next week, the same voice that had dismissed me as not certain called me. But it was a different voice entirely, thin, urgent, pleading. "Mrs. Hale," Sophie said, "we haven't paid the landlord. If you don't transfer the money this week, he'll evict us. You forgot to send it." It was a practiced desperation. I'd heard that tone many times, on the phone, in my kitchen at midnight, in notes left on my table, and I'd always reacted the same way. I would swallow whatever pride I still had and go to the bank. Only this time I remembered those two small, brutal words, certain people. "Do you remember who is certain, Sophie?" I asked slowly, keeping my voice steady. "Because I only help certain people." A silence stretched. Then she began to smooth over it with pet phrases. "You're like a second mother," she said. "We love you." It was the same script that had gotten money out of me before, the "we love you" that arrived just before the bill arrived. For years, I had been excellent at making myself small and invisible, at giving until I was hollow, because I'd convinced myself that to be a good mother was to be a provider above all else. I had economized my life to cushion theirs. I had counted out coins into envelopes labeled rent and groceries while eating the same plain meals, and a hole in the pocket of my favorite coat went unrepaired because the money had to go to them. I had saved for retirement, tucked away a little legacy from my husband Robert, and then watched those savings dissolve into a pattern of transfers. $500 monthly here, $300 for groceries there, loans repaid with others' hands on my shoulder, promising to pay me back someday. I had used the currency I knew how to offer, money, to buy stability for 2 adults who seemed determined to behave like children. I opened my checkbook and tallied up the amounts. The sums gathered like truth in bright, cold numbers that admitted no sentiment. Rent for 36 months, groceries, presents, health expenses, repairs, the television we bought because theirs had died and it was raining, loans I'd forgiven, the sofa, the emergency transfer on a Tuesday night that saved them from being shut out. The total shocked me with its immensity, $33,400. I touched the pencil mark and felt it like a scar. When the phone rang with Daniel's name on the screen, I could have answered and let the old rhythms begin. Pillow talk over money, apologies, promises that evaporated like breath. Instead, I let it ring until it stopped. I unhooked my purse, locked the door, and went for a walk without a list or a reason. I had not done that in a long time. My errands had always been errands for them. Today, I walked
stopped at the
simply
bank where I
because
had
my
been a
knees
portrait of
wanted to feel the
predictability
movement for years. The branch manager, Mr. Doyle, knew me by name. He'd processed that steady withdrawal schedule the way a clock registers the hours. Without comment, without curiosity. He greeted me with a warm, professional concern. "Mrs. Hale, is everything all right?" he asked, when I explained briefly that I wanted to cancel the automatic transfers to my son's account. "Yes," I said. "Everything is as it should be now." His eyebrows rose, the human part of him asking the question I wasn't sure I could answer. Was I being pressured? For the first time in years, the person at the counter asked me if I was certain I wanted to take care of myself. I canceled the automatic payments. I closed the accounts they had access to, moved money to a new bank, got a new debit card that belonged to no one else. A small practical act, paper signed, forms filed, felt like the first honest act of my life in years. On the walk home, I felt light as if some invisible weight had been set down. That same afternoon, I returned to the house and found 3 cars parked in front, engines ticking. I felt a cold prickle of fear, no different from the fear I'd felt when they'd asked to borrow the car because their brakes were squealing and then never returned it on time. But the fear had a new companion, resolve. They had keys. I'd given them keys because I had trusted them. The thought of them entering my home uninvited no longer made me panic so much as it made me angry. When I opened the door, Daniel sat hunched on the living room couch with his head in his hands, Sophie pacing like a bird in a cage, and a man in a neat suit rifling through my papers on the dining table as if the place belonged to him. The man introduced himself as an attorney. Thick name, polite smile, sent by them to look after my interests. My interests. It was the word that made my skin creak. "You're in my house," I said. "These are my papers." The lawyer barely blinked. "Mrs. Hale," he said with the measured tones of a man trained to lead, "your children are concerned about your behavior. They asked us to evaluate whether you're capable of managing your finances." It took me a second to understand the shape of what he implied, that being human meant you could be declared incompetent at the stroke of a pen, that love could be distorted into a legal weapon. This man, with business cards and a firm handshake, made no attempt to disguise the plan. If I refused to yield, they would argue I was confused, that I had lost my mind. He placed a tidy folder on my table, entitled Welfare and Conservatorship, as if that were a neutral thing we could all leaf through, together, as if we were at an office holiday party. That night, I let each piece of the day replay in my head. The humiliation, the wedding I had not been invited to after all I had given, words that tasted like salt, was not the worst thing. Worse was the casualness with which 2 people I loved had weaponized the language of caring to take what they wanted. We only invited certain people had become an instrument of their appetite. A small, almost private rage took root. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't plan violence. I took out the checkbook, the account histories, the receipts stacked in a corner of my desk, and I made copies. I went to see Mr. Patel, an attorney I had known for decades through my late husband's estate, and he listened without frowning. When I finished, laying out the story with its numbers and dates, his face tightened. "Evelyn," he said, using my given name as if the use of it conferred gravity. "What they tried to do today is called elder financial abuse. It's not only cruel, it's illegal." Hearing the words named, abuse, made me sit straighter. "Can they do it?" I asked. "Can they take my money, my house?" "They could try," he said, "but you have documentation. We'll prepare a defense. We'll protect you." Preparation feels good. It is a thing you can do that moves you from the place of victim to the place of actor. We drew up plans, change the locks, install a security system, file a legal notice that any contact must be routed through my attorney, and most importantly, gather evidence. I left his office with a list of actions and a strange, steady feeling that I was reclaiming myself. The following morning, the locksmith came. The old door clicked differently as the new keys turned. A pair of cameras, discreet, efficient, went up under the eaves and in the hallway. I felt stupid for a minute, like a person outfitting a fort rather than a home, but the next time the front steps creaked at an unexpected hour, I was grateful. That day, Sophie rang from an unknown number. I had blocked her before. She had the nerve to call from a borrowed line. She tried to sound reasonable, and worse, repentant. "Evelyn," she said, "we thought not inviting you to the wedding would spare you the trouble. It was a small thing. It would have been awkward. We wanted to keep it intimate. We are truly sorry." "Who paid for your dress?" I asked. "Who paid for the cake and the champagne?" A pause. All of it came out of a small fund. I named the number Sophie had used to ask me for money 2 weeks ago, for rent, for a ring, for a last-minute repair, and let her hear the truth. I didn't shout. I told her plainly why I had stopped paying. I told her calmly that the word special had been used to exclude me. The exposure of her little lie silenced her for a moment. Finally, she spoke. "Yes," she confessed, as if my question had cut through a veil. "We do need money. That is part of it." There it was, the moment when the mask slipped and the hustler's plain hunger showed through. She tried to catch the moment and salvage something. "We love you, Evelyn." But the words had the hollow sound of coins dropped into a cup. I hung up. I put the phone face down, then turned it off entirely. I didn't want to listen to their pleading. I didn't want to be their emergency fund anymore. I wanted to know what it felt like to take a day that belonged entirely to me. I went to the hairdresser I had not visited in a year. I had postponed that appointment so many times that the stylists joked I had become part of the furniture. They fussed over me with the kind of attention that is not transactional, and when my hair was done, cut and styled with a bright new shade that made my eyes sparkle, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman who had spent decades crafting herself into a mother who never mattered except when money was needed. There was a lightness, a small rebellion in the curl of my hair. Neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Harper from 2 doors down, silver hair, lipstick that always looked impossibly red, knocked with an apple pie, and a gossip that was halfway compassion, halfway triumph. "I didn't want to say anything," she said, "but I saw your daughter-in-law at the grocery last week. They'll patch up, you know. People do." People do patch up, sometimes. But the more significant point is that people change when their margins tighten. A neighbor I barely knew, Mrs. Ortega, came by and told me softly about her own life, about when she stopped paying for her unemployed brother's rent, and how, in time, he found a job and stopped calling her at midnight to beg. Her story offered patterns, not promises. After a string of sleepless nights, I made 3 calls. To my attorney, to the local police, to let them know that an unauthorized attempt had been made to coerce me into signing documents, and to the office that handled elder affairs. My trust in institutions had grown thin, but I kept faith that the law could be a shield if wielded judiciously and truthfully. A few days later, they came again. Daniel and Sophie pulled into the driveway in 2 cars and then sat, engines running, looking around as if plotting. I watched them on the screen from the safety of my living room. I sat so still you could have missed me. Sometimes the urge to confront them on the spot is a movie impulse. In life, one learns the value of advantage. I called my attorney. He arrived with a calm that steadied me and then phoned the local patrol. He had already applied, as a precaution, for a restraining order. The next hour unfolded with the indifferent efficiency of civic procedure. Officers spoke to them, clarified the law, asked them to leave. "I can't believe you called the police on your own son," Daniel shouted across the street as they drove away, his voice hot with a righteous fury. "Mom, think about what you're doing. You're isolating yourself." "Family doesn't break into a house and go through someone's papers," I said, and the words surprised the neighbors who emerged, robes and curious faces, peering from their lawns. I stood in my doorway and felt a strange clarity. if love had stages, perhaps one of them should include the honoring of boundaries. The legal harassment, however, did not end at the curb. Daniel and Sophie hired a different attorney, one with a manner that suggested courtroom time was his favorite currency. A week later, I received notice that they had filed suit, claiming that I was mentally incapable of managing my finances and seeking the appointment of a guardian. The paperwork was clinical, its language precise and cold. Incapacity, inability to manage funds, risk of harm. Someone had taught them that the law could be turned like a key to open whatever door they wanted. If there is a moment of acute animal terror, it is standing in the middle of a kitchen and reading that strangers might decide you are no longer fit to make choices. I sat on the edge of the counter, the paper trembling in my hands, thinking of the nights Robert and I had worked the store together, of the mortgage we'd paid, of the small joys we'd managed on modest salaries, and of the money from his estate I had kept small and safe because I had wanted a cushion for my later years. They wanted to call me incapable so they could access those dollars without asking. That is when the war began. We dug up documentation of every transfer I had made, bank statements, records, receipts. I made photocopies and started keeping a log, dates, amounts, reasons. The number kept returning, $33,400. The sheer repetition of it in ink gave it the shape of reality. My life had been a ledger. Now that ledger testified. We took other measures, too. I had Dr. Lillian Moore, a geriatric psychiatrist with a reputation for fairness, do a comprehensive cognitive assessment. She spent hours with me, testing memory, executive function, attention, the little puzzles and the logic problems that might trap a frail mind. When she finished, she smiled and said, "Mrs. Hale, you're sharp." Her report, clear, professional, and thorough, would become a central pillar in our defense. Neighbors, friends, and women from the community center came forward to testify on my behalf. There were women I'd known for years, Luce from the sewing circle, Marianne from the book club, who had seen me in my daily life, who had watched me make lunch and volunteer at the shelter, and drive myself to the doctor and keep my house as tidy as it ever had been. They described me as consistent, competent, and socially engaged, how I had learned pottery, how I'd started taking a noon walk, how my paintings had become the talk of the community craft fair. People who had been on the receiving end of my kindness now offered theirs, but the case was ugly nonetheless. Sophie presented a tidy narrative, a doting daughter-in-law finding worrying signs, a son forced to make difficult choices. They brought forward a neighbor who said he had seen me yelling, a pharmacist with a signature that looked awkwardly obtained, and a physician who had been provided with only a small piece of the story. My attorney, a firm gentleman named Mr. Patel, took each claim and laid it open to the light. He showed how the neighbor's observation was anecdotal, how the pharmacist's statement had been procured through misdirection, how the physician's notes were partial. Court is surreal when it's your life that's deconstructed. There were days I lay awake and rehearsed responses to questions I might be asked. What was my relationship with my son? How did I spend my time? Why did I pause transfers? I answered not with acrimony, but with steadiness. On the stand, I spoke in a voice that was both personal and precise. I told the judge about the marriage we had had, about Robert's death, and the way I raised Daniel on the earnings of my small job, the nights I worked overtime so he could finish school, the prayers I had said into the pillow. I told him about the nights I had felt foolish, buying groceries while my own pajamas grew threadbare, in the earnest but quiet hope that a mother's giving brings a different kind of return, gratitude, affection. I told him the truth about the wedding, the pictures I'd found online, the faces I didn't know, the whispered excuse, certain people, that had stabbed me. The law protects the vulnerable, the judge said during one long afternoon, his face, older, competent, set in a look that seemed to examine everything and spare nothing. But the law also protects the right of an adult who is competent to choose how to spend her resources. When the verdict came, it was all careful language and slow release. The judge ruled in my favor. He found no evidence I lacked capacity. Indeed, the documentation suggested deliberate exploitation. The request for guardianship was denied. When the words were read, there was a kind, human softening around the edges of the official voice that made my eyes sting. Daniel and Sophie did not speak to me afterwards. Their lawyer left a curt note. "We will pursue other options." But we all understood what the judge had seen and what the law had refused to allow. I could tell you that the end of the trial erased all my pain and that everything curved smoothly into a serene sunset. It did not. There were nights I wept alone, not only for the broken trust, but for the grief of recognizing how much I had given in an attempt to purchase the warmth of family. I grieved the loss of the son I had imagined. I grieved the resources spent. I grieved the hollow shell of what I had thought was closeness. Yet there was also a fierce, unfamiliar joy that arrived once the suit was dismissed, an affirmation that I had rights, an acknowledgement that my life was mine. In the months that followed, I did things that felt small and revolutionary. I took an art class and learned to throw clay on the wheel. My hands, which had been used to folding napkins and doing laundry for hands that never said thank you, cupped wet clay and shaped bowls that looked, to my amazement, like little moons. I took a trip with 2 women from the book club to the coast. We ate fish and walked along a beach where the waves erased footprints in a single sweep. I joined a volunteer organization that advocates for seniors' rights and used my experience as testimony. How easy it can be for love to turn into leverage. How the language of care can disguise coercion. Word in the neighborhood moved in quiet circles. I discovered that Daniel and Sophie had to find new ways to pay for rent, different apartments, different groceries. I heard through a cousin of a cousin that Sophie got a job at a small private clinic and that Daniel had begun repairing computers for neighbors, earning modest sums. I wished them well in a distant, practical way. I did not want to be cruel. If their struggle forced them into independence, perhaps the universe had its own plan for making them learn the things I had tried to teach with money. I sold the house I had lived in for 35 years and moved to a smaller apartment near the city center, a place with a balcony and a view of the river. I donated part of my savings to a nonprofit that helped seniors navigate financial abuse and used the rest to travel and to start a small fund for emergencies that did not involve people who considered me a resource. Sometimes I think of the house on quiet nights, of the garden my hands had tended, of the front steps where children had learned to tie shoelaces. Selling it felt like a gentle severing, an acceptance that chapters close and allow others to begin. If there is a single lesson that the years have taught me, it is this: generosity must be married to wisdom. Giving is beautiful when it nourishes and sustains. It becomes a slow violence when it erases the giver. A mother who gives without boundaries risks building a life for her child that she cannot inhabit. I do not regret the early kindnesses. There were times when help was needed, when my heart swelled, and I do not regret the late remedy of choosing myself. The lesson is not one of calculus alone. It is a lesson in respect for the self. Some nights I sit on my balcony with a cup of tea and sketch the city as the lights shimmer across the water. I have new friends, women who have their own stories of resilience. We meet for lunches where conversation is gentle and reciprocal. One week about a play we saw, another about a good doctor we recommend. There is laughter that is not transactional. I volunteer with a hotline that supports older adults facing exploitation, and sometimes I take calls. "You are not alone," I tell them, and when I hear their voices, often trembling, often relieved to be heard, I think about how listening can be a lifeline. Will Daniel ever call? Perhaps. People change in the slow, uneven ways life allows. I have learned not to anchor my happiness to a possibility I cannot control. If he calls, I will listen. I will set my boundaries first. I will refuse to let kindness be abused. There is nothing cold about that. There is only tender self-preservation. I sometimes imagine what would have happened if I had never stopped. If I had continued to be the bank around which their lives orbited, they might have lived with ease now. But at what cost? My own life would have shriveled into a ledger of obligations and lost opportunities. What I did felt radical because I had been taught, like many women of my generation, that self-sacrifice was an act of virtue. I have relearned virtue as a balanced coin, no longer only spent on others but invested in a life that is mine. A week of bright afternoons after the final hearing, my neighbor Gloria invited me to her daughter's small gallery show. Among the paintings, I recognized faces, people who had stood by me, who had listened while I rehearsed my testimony aloud, who had brought casseroles and news articles and legal advice. We stood together and watched sunlight crawl across canvases. Someone raised a glass and we toasted the small victory, the right to be the author of our own days. Sometimes when the moon is high, I think of Robert. I speak to him as if he were in the next room. "We did all right," I tell him, and laugh, the sound unexpectedly clear. The future still holds uncertainties, health slips, bureaucratic annoyances, the dull ache of loneliness that can arrive like rain, but it also holds the possibility of mornings that belong to me, of afternoons filled with classes and friends, of evenings where the radio hums while I cook dinner for one and no one calls to ask for money. I sleep better now. I wake up earlier, filled with a small, steady anticipation. Once, when an interviewer for a local paper asked me what I had learned most from the ordeal, I said, "Respect is not something you buy. It's something you earn by how others choose to love you and how you choose to love yourself." The line made the front page in a single column. People nodded. Some wrote letters. Some came to meetings and shared their own stories, and my living room became a place where broken things were mended, not by cash, but by conversation and understanding. On the anniversary of the day they told me they'd been married without me, I did not stay home to lament. I took a train to a coastal town I'd wanted to see for years. Walking along the cliffs, the wind scraping my face, I felt a fierce and foolish joy. There were other lives to look at, other examples to study, families who ignored inheritance and lived by conversation, women who'd left others who had taken too much. The world was not single-threaded. It was a braid. My task at last was to weave my strand into something beautiful again. People sometimes ask if I regret the money. They suppose there is a ledger in the mind where sums are either debts or gifts. If you ask me to balance those columns, I'll tell you this plainly. Money I gave when it mattered saved nights of fear and hungry days. But money I gave out of fear of loneliness or out of misplaced obligation was lost in a way that no bank can reconcile. The larger lesson is not accounting. It is about dignity, giving in ways that honor you, not diminish you. And so I live small rebellions now. A painting class on Wednesdays, a brunch with friends on Sundays, a garden window where I grow herbs, and a small lemon tree that blooms, stubborn and fragrant. I made new wills, clear, precise documents that protect what is mine and leave what I care about to causes that matter. I wrote a note in my files that any change of guardianship must be reviewed by my attorney and 2 independent advisors. I learned the language of protection because I had to, because love must sometimes be defended with pens and signatures and the dry language of law. I cannot pretend the wound is fully healed. There are evenings when a sudden picture in my mind of a wedding cake or of a laugh in a frame will make my throat close. But those are moments, quick and sharp as they are. And mostly, I am grateful. Grateful for the women who sat with me when the suit was filed, for the attorney who believed, for the doctors who examined me like people who cared about truth, and for the neighbors who brought out chairs and casseroles and compassion. In time, I met someone at a community theater rehearsal, a man who painted sets and had a laugh that sounded like kettlebell music. We did not rush. Perhaps it was only companionship, someone to share coffee with in the mornings and to trade stories with in the evenings. We went slowly and properly, like two cautious cats assessing a patch of sun. When he held my hand at the intermission of a small play, I felt none of the alarm of those early days when I learned to be needed, and everything of the sweeter kind of need that is mutual. If you are listening to this and wondering what you would do in my place, know that there is no single correct path. Some choose to keep on giving until the end, others choose to hold back. The important thing is to make that choice with eyes open. Count what you have, listen to your body, talk to someone who knows how to read the language of law and finance, and remember, generosity without boundaries can become an instrument of harm. My name is Evelyn Hale. I am 72. I have lived many lives within this one: wife, mother, employee, volunteer, litigant, and student of resilience. I have learned that dignity is not inherited, it is cultivated. I have relearned how to love myself fiercely and tenderly, and how to let the people who desire connection find their way to it without the exchange of notes scribbled in my checkbook. The nights are softer now. The dishes in my small apartment sink line up like punctuations at the end of simple, satisfying meals. My photographs show friends who came to the trial for me, faces lined and smiling, and they remind me that community can be built after betrayal. I travel when I feel like it. I send part of my resources to causes that protect the vulnerable, and I teach a few classes at the community center about managing one's finances and setting boundaries. There's a kind of peace in choosing your life with attention. It is not the peace of having had everything, but the peace of having chosen wisely what remains. And if, on a windy afternoon, you pass an old woman with a bright scarf darting across a town square, laughing with friends, perhaps that is me. Maybe I'm holding a small ceramic bowl I made in class, or perhaps I'm about to sign a petition for someone who needs help. I will wave. I will smile. I will be present. Love is not a ledger, but it should not be a ledger's excuse either. We can love fiercely and still protect ourselves. We can give and we can keep. We can be generous and wise. The most important relationship I have now is with myself. It is the one that will last the longest and hold the truest mirror to who I am. If you want to know how the story ends, listen for the ordinary sounds: the kettle singing, footsteps on worn steps, a letter from an old friend, the brush of fingers in clay, the small, stubborn laughter that fills rooms that used to be quiet. That is how the story winds down, slowly, with small joys stitched in the places where fear once lived.